Of prayer. The Lord be with you. The Lord of Lords and King of Kings, we give you thanks that you come to us as a Prince of Peace. And we ask, O God, that you send your Spirit among us, a spirit of discernment, that as we wrestle with worldly authorities, we might have your wisdom to put our trust in you and to act as you call us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right. So as we talk about authorities, I want to say this is part one introduction. There's going to be a total of 6 parts to this class. But I want to start us off with a passage of Scripture that in my mind really highlights the questions we have to wrestle with when we talk about authority. So it comes from 2 Kings chapter 2. The prophet Elisha went up from there to Bethel. And while he was going up on the way, some small boys of the city came out and jeered at him, saying, "Go away, bald head! Go away, bald head!" I'm going to take a moment now to cover up my little spot on the back there. When he turned around and saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. Then 2 she-bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the boys. Yeah. Quick question. Show of hands, how many people knew this story was in our Bible? How many of you are familiar with this story? It's not one people preach a lot on Sundays. I don't know why. All right, I got to say one thing real quick, which is to say, it's not, calling Elisha bald isn't just a critique of his appearance. His mentor, the man who has just died and from whom he has inherited the mantle of leading prophet of Israel, was Elijah, and Elijah was known as the Lord of Hair. Elijah's hairiness was his identifying characteristic, so much so that in future generations, to be a prophet meant wearing a hair shirt, which is why John the Baptist wears a hair shirt. It's the sign of a prophet. For Elisha to be called bald is to say, you are not a legitimate prophet. You are not the heir of the Lord of Hair. This is a stinging critique of Elisha's authority. All right, so what do we make of this? Well, the Bible doesn't tell us what we're supposed to make of this story. It just tells us this story. And I love this story because I think the way we interpret this story tells us a lot about how we think about authority in general, right? There are some people who read this story as it is a clear instruction not to question those in authority. You question someone in authority, they're going to stick some bears on you at God's command. That's the message of the story, yeah? Maybe the point isn't don't question those in authority. Maybe another interpretation could be it's a warning. Look, if you question those in authority, this might happen to you, so just beware. I think a final interpretation of this could be a question to those in authority, to say, if you have the power to call down wild bears who maul children, are you going to do that? And you can read this as a critique of people in authority who use their authority to injure the innocent simply because of their own insecurity. Right? Those are 3 radically different interpretations of the same story, and the Bible doesn't tell us which one is right. We have to figure that out for ourselves. All right, so I start off with this because that's going to be sort of a big theme in this class, is you have to figure it out for yourself, right? All right, let's see if I can. All right, so there's some questions raised by this story. And these are the questions we're going to wrestle with over the next 5 weeks. There's the question of, to what extent are Christians called to honor those in authority, right? Can we be the little boys saying, person claims to be a prophet, he's really bald, yeah? Can we be those people? When and how can Christians wield coercive authority, right? Can we be Elisha saying, these kids are out of line, and we're sicking the bears on them? Can we be those people? When and how can we resist those in authority? When can we say, no, it's actually our duty to point out that our leader is bald? Yeah? And then finally, how can Christians wield, honor, and resist, right? How can we do all three of those things at the same time in a democracy? Because in a democracy, you all are people of authority. And so you wield it, and you have to decide how you honor other people's authority, and you might have a responsibility in a democracy to resist your leaders. That's built into our Constitution. But today, I want to lay down some frameworks. When I say authority in this class, I don't mean spiritual authority, right? I don't mean the kind of authority that comes from seeing someone's a real upstanding guy and you say, oh, I'm going to listen to what they have to say. No, I'm talking about legal authority as represented by Lady Justice, right? On the one hand, she's got the scales of justice to determine what is right and wrong, and she is blind so that she doesn't show favoritism, but she wields a sword to enforce justice as she weighs it, right? That's the kind of authority I am talking about, authority that is backed up by the sword. I'll call it coercive authority or coercive force. Also want to be clear, Greg's back there. But hopefully I can do it with this. All right. So in this class, I am not going to tell you what the American Constitution and legal system says is the appropriate role for Christians to interact with authority. If you want to find that out, go talk to a lawyer, or a constitutional scholar. I am neither of those things. I am not an expert on American law. I know what's in the Bible, and I know a fair amount of the Christian tradition, and so that is what I will be talking to you about over the course of this class. We on the same page? Now, on the very last class, when we talk about democracy, we'll get a little bit into maybe how our legal framework works, but that's not going to be the focus of this. All right. The other thing I want to say is this is not going to be a class in which there is one correct answer, which I am going to tell you and expect you to abide by. This is going to be a class of conversations of voices, yours included, although I will do most of the talking. And it will also include different voices within the Christian tradition, because here's the thing, Christians throughout history, and even in the same time of history, and even within the same denominations, disagree on what Christians' relationship to those in authority should be. And the real quick breakdown of this is from the time of Jesus' crucifixion to the year 313, when Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan saying that Christianity is no longer illegal, right? He didn't make it the state Roman religion. He just said it's no longer illegal. But for 300 years, Christians' primary relationship to those in authority was to be thrown to lions, Or this is, you can see the Christians are huddled there in this picture, and there's some people on poles behind them. The Emperor Nero, famously fiddled when Rome burned. He needed someone to blame for the burning of Rome. He needed a scapegoat. There's this crazy new religion called Christians. He said, well, they did it. They caused Rome to burn. And so he rounded up Christians, and he put them on poles, and he covered them in tar, and he set them on fire. He turned Christians into tiki torches, is what the Emperor Nero did. Right, that was Christianity's primary relationship with those in authority for 300 years. But then, a couple generations after Constantine, one of his descendants made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And from about the year 400 to the 20th century, historians refer to a period of Christendom. And this is when Christianity works hand and glove with those who are in secular authority. In this picture, you can see there's a bishop crowning a king, and I think it's actually supposed to be Charlemagne, the Pope crowning Charlemagne as the Holy Roman Emperor. And there is this sense that the church is going to support those in government, and the government is going to, through the sword, support the church. Today, though, in the 20th century, scholars say we live in a post-Christendom, where, culturally Christianity is still around. The government doesn't really enforce Christianity anymore, but we still got a lot of these old institutions and buildings kicking around, even if a lot of them are mostly empty. And so we have seen, just on a very basic level, how Christianity and authority have changed relationships over the last 2,000 years. But today what I want to focus on, I put this in here to remind you and remind me. Each week, we're going to cover a very different aspect of Christians' relationship with authority, and a lot of these seem contradictory. They exist in tension with each other, and I really encourage you to come to all 5 weeks. If you can't make it, it'll be online. You can go to YouTube. We'll put it in our link in our e-blast and our Facebook page. Be sure to watch all the classes, because if you just watch one class, you're going to get a skewed perspective of what I'm teaching, and you're going to get mad at me. If you come to all the classes, you'll have a proper perspective of why to be mad at me. Yeah? All right. No. There we go. All right, so part 2. Christ's rejection of force. Right? Christ's rejection of coercive authority. As Christians, when we talk about our relationship to those in authority, we have to wrestle with the fact that for himself, Jesus very clearly rejected authority through force. After Jesus feeds the multitudes and he's healing people, folks are so excited about this Jesus guy that they attempt to make him king by force. When Jesus sees this happens, he withdraws. He does not want to be made an earthly king. And he's going to double down on this when he's on trial before Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate is going to say, "You're accused of being a king. What's up with that?" And Jesus answered, "My kingdom does not belong to this world. If my kingdom belonged to this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jewish leaders. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." So far, nothing particularly controversial, yeah? Jesus' kingdom is not of this world. Okay. Jesus refuses armed defense. So in the Garden of Gethsemane, right, Judas has betrayed Jesus. Soldiers come to arrest Jesus. Before they go to that garden, Jesus tells his disciples to bring with them a bag, a purse, and a sword. And his disciples say, "Well, we got 2 swords right here." And Jesus replies, "It is enough." It's worth noting that Americans love our Second Amendment. Yeah, it's a big part of American culture. And American Christians really want the Second Amendment to be a God-given right. And so they'll pull out this verse and say, Jesus is saying his disciples have the right to bear arms from this verse. They don't finish reading the chapter, because when those soldiers actually come to arrest Jesus, the disciples take out a sword, one of those 2 swords, and they strike the slave of the high priest to cut off his ear, and Jesus said, "No more of this." And he touched the slave's ear and heals him. Right? Jesus tells his disciples to bring those swords in that moment so that Jesus can tell them, you don't get to use swords. Right? If you don't have a sword, it's very hard to claim, well, I chose pacifism. It's like, well, you didn't have a choice to choose it. If you have a weapon, now you can actually make a choice to choose pacifism. And Jesus is telling his disciples, no, do not use weapons to defend me. Okay? Jesus doesn't only reject an armed defense. However, he also rejects a legal defense. Jesus gets put on trial. But when he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he did not answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many accusations they make against you?" But Jesus gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. He's on trial and he doesn't mount a single defense against himself. This is going to come up again as Christians figure out what this means for them. So not only does Jesus reject armed defense of himself, reject legal defense of himself, but he forbids resistance by force to his disciples. This is the Sermon on the Mount. Because of the church calendar this year, we didn't get to read this on a Sunday. If Easter was 2 weeks later, we would have read this in church, but we didn't this year. So Jesus says, "You have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer." What? "But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, give your coat as well." Right? Do not resist an evildoer, period. Someone smacks you on the right cheek, turn the other one, let them smack you again. Rejection of armed resistance and also a rejection of legal resistance, right? If someone sues you and through legal channels has the right to take your coat, you know what? Or take your shirt, don't fight him in court, just give him your coat also. Now, when we get to when Christians actually do choose to resist, we're going to dig a little bit more into precisely what this means. But for now, let's just be clear. Jesus says, don't fight back, either physically or legally. I feel like at this point, we start to get a little more like, really, Jesus? There's some really bad people out there. It sounds beautiful, but really? Here's the other thing to note. Jesus never explicitly criticizes the government. This is in contrast to John the Baptist. John the Baptist goes on record critiquing King Herod because King Herod convinced his sister-in-law to divorce his brother and marry him. And John the Baptist is like, let me pull out some passages from the Old Testament that forbids that. Jesus, on the other hand, never says anything explicitly critiquing the government. The closest he comes is some Pharisees came and said to him, "Get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you." He said to them, "Go and tell that fox for me. Listen, I am casting out demons and performing cures today and tomorrow, and on the third day I will finish my work." Right? The closest he comes to critiquing the government is calling Herod a fox. Like being foxy, is that a good thing, a bad thing? I don't know. You decide for yourself. I don't think he means it as a compliment. But there's never an explicit critique of Pontius Pilate or Caesar. Now that said, the entire New Testament is an implicit critique of the Roman government, and we will get to that. But let's be clear, he never explicitly critiques the Roman government. And then finally, Jesus asks us to decide what the right relationship for a follower of God is with the government. So Jesus is in the temple and he's teaching, and different people are essentially trying to trick him and prove their theological superiority to him. And so two competing factions, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who normally don't get along, they both come to him together and ask him, is it appropriate to pay taxes to Caesar? And he asks, well, give me the coin that you use to pay the tax. And so they bring him a denarius, which has the face of Caesar on it, which is an act of idolatry, right? Jewish people aren't supposed to have graven images. And on the coin, it says, this is the Son of God, claiming that Caesar is divine, which is another act of idolatry. And so they bring him a denarius, and he said to them, whose head and whose title is this? They answered, Caesar's. Jesus said to them, give to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God's. And they were utterly amazed at him. What's delightful about his response is he doesn't tell us what is God's and what is Caesar's. That's up for you to figure out. And today I'm going to talk to you about all the many different ways Christians have answered this question. Okay, I have on here a spectrum. On the far left side of the spectrum is this is not a political left and right, just happens to work out this way. On the far left of the spectrum is the idea that what is God's and what are Caesar's are two entirely different things, and they have no overlap with each other. You might even say nothing belongs to Caesar because everything belongs to God. On the other end of the spectrum, you have this idea that what is Caesar's and what are God's overlap, and maybe even for the same reason, maybe because everything belongs to God, including Caesar. So on the far right there, I have a picture of a crusader, and he is standing in for the papacy during the Middle Ages. And the Pope's argument in the Middle Ages is everything belongs to God, including Caesar, kings and secular authorities. You belong to me as God's representative here on earth. And so maybe I, as the Pope, shouldn't personally fight, but you, as kings, are here to serve me, and if I need you to fight on my behalf, that's your job. The Crusades are this amazing moment in Christian history. Amazing, not in a great way. Right, as Lutherans, we all know about indulgences. Yes, this idea that you could pay money to earn merits in heaven to get you out of purgatory and into heaven sooner. So in addition to paying money for an indulgence, you could also do acts of service. One of the acts of service that you could do is to go on a pilgrimage. But in the year 1099, there was a problem in that the Holy Land was no longer safe for Christians. It had been ruled by Muslims for 300 years at this point, maybe more. But there was a tribe of Turks who had come in and started rampaging around the Holy Land, and they kept killing Christian pilgrims. And so you couldn't do your indulgence pilgrimage. The Byzantine, the Eastern Roman Empire, asked Western Christians, come and help us reclaim this land for Christians and also make it safe for pilgrims. And so the Pope said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to do a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, but we're all going to carry swords. It's an armed pilgrimage, and in this way, by carrying the sword, you are earning merits in heaven for Jesus. Now you can earn merits for Jesus by killing, not good Christians, because that would be a sin, obviously, but by killing infidels. Now you're doing good work on Jesus' behalf, and you can actually be a spiritually good person for doing it. This is a watershed moment in Christianity, because up until this point, the Christians had said, well, you can use military force for defensive purposes, but it's never a holy thing to do. It is, unfortunately, a sinful thing we have to do in this broken world. But this is the first time Christians say, nope, you can actually get points to go to heaven for killing people. In its extreme form, the theology of armed pilgrimage, of the Crusades, manifests itself in mystic orders, the most famous of which are the Knights Templar. So the Knights Templar were a group of knights who wanted to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land, and they had set up shop on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, where the old temple used to be. They were living up there, and whenever people would want to come to one of the holy sites, they would come out in their armor and protect the pilgrims so they could safely visit a holy site and leave. And after a while, they petitioned the Pope to say, you know what? We aren't just knights. We are monks, right? We will take vows of poverty and celibacy and obedience, and we are going to be warrior monks, right? This is, Jesus said, right, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, give them the other one. Somehow we have made it to you can be a monk killing people. That's sort of the extreme end of the overlap of Caesar and God's world. Just a step down from that is the Orthodox Church. Now, the Orthodox Church and Catholicism developed in two very different ways, right? Catholicism always had this pope who was setting himself against the secular rulers in Western Europe. But in Orthodoxy, the way it works is each kingdom has their own separate version of orthodoxy. They all get along with each other, but there's no one head over all the churches in every country. Instead, there's the head bishop for that country who works alongside the king of that country. They talk about the relationship of church and state as symphonia, which is to say church and state are not two separate things. They are one thing with two separate roles. Yeah, so in the military, you've got the Marines and you've got the Air Force. They're not like two separate things. They're just two different branches that work in combination for the same military end. And that was the thought. And so you can actually see there a bishop blessing missiles on a jet fighter. Yeah, this is a very common sight in Orthodoxy, where Orthodox priests, they will bless rifles and tanks and even submarines and bombers that carry nuclear weapons. They will go and bless those things because those things are working in defense of their country, which is also working in defense of their church. They don't see those as two separate things. It's been critiqued, the Orthodox tradition has been critiqued of having what's called Caesaropapism, which is to say, while they don't have a pope, Caesar, when there was still a Caesar, often acted as the head of the church. And we see this manifesting itself again in Russia, right, where Putin says, that's what we want to bring. Communism is dead, but we're not going to go Western secular capitalists. We're going to return to imperial orthodoxy, where the czar is functionally the head of the church, and the church exists to prop up the czar. You're going to bless my war for me as I go invade Ukraine. And the Russian Orthodox Church has done that to the horror of the rest of the Orthodox world. Just a step down from that is our good friend Martin Luther. Yeah? So Martin Luther developed this idea that there are two separate kingdoms. There's the kingdom of God, the kingdom of the right hand, and the kingdom of the sword, the secular rulers, the kingdom of the left hand. And what Martin Luther says is God has instituted both, but they need to be separate from each other, but not the way we think of church and state being separate. They need to be separate from each other in the way that we think of Congress and the Supreme Court as being separate from each other, right? They're two branches of the same government that are meant to hold each other in check and balance. And so what Luther will do is he will actually ask the German nobility, the German princes, to establish and protect what we will come to think of as the Lutheran Church. He needs this to happen because otherwise Rome, the Pope, and the Holy Roman Emperor are going to come and wipe out Lutherans. And so Luther says, now it's the job of the German government, they weren't a unified government at the time, many small governments, to band together and protect the Lutheran Church. And the Lutheran Church's job is to tell people to support the government, but the church does have a responsibility to call out the government when they are not in line with God's teachings, and the government has a responsibility to prevent heresy from taking over the church. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it's not our separation of church and state. It is a separation of church and state. I took a vow when I became ordained that I would teach and preach in accordance with Luther's teaching. I took a vow to teach you Luther's thoughts on this. I did not take a vow to convince you of Luther's thoughts on this, yeah? So if you end up somewhere else, I'm not going to be mad at you. All right. Next down, I have Billy Graham. And Billy Graham kind of stands in for, the historic American Baptist perspective on church and state. American Baptists as a whole will look at Luther and say, Luther, you sold out. Because Luther, you have established a state religion, right? The churches in Germany and in Scandinavia are funded by the government. And ultimately what that means is the churches are going to answer to the government rather than to God or maybe even the needs of their congregation. And so the American Baptist tradition has historically said the church should be completely separate from the government for the sake of the church. But that said, you get folks like Billy Graham who says, but we got lots to say to the government, and we'll cozy up real close and try to turn them around to our way. And that's, I think Billy Graham was called the pastor to presidents, right? There were 5 different presidents of both political parties to which he was their spiritual advisor. And I think some good came of that. I think Billy Graham also acknowledged at the end of the life that he was disappointed in some of the ways in which politicians made use of him instead of him really influencing politicians for the sake of the gospel that he had hoped to happen. But there is still this sense that Christians should be involved in civic life, even if it's a rejection of a state-enforced religion. Just down from him, I have Quakers, represented by, Quaker Oats. Now, Quakers go back to the 1600s in England, and over the course of the last 400 years, they have had a lot of variation. But one of the big things from the beginning Quakers were about was, who gets to decide who's a better authority to preach and teach? The government? Right? In England at their time, the government was saying, well, this person's an ordained minister, this person's an ordained minister, they have the right to preach. And Quakers said, the government doesn't get to decide who's fit to proclaim God's word. And in fact, most Quakers don't have ordained clergy at all. Right? Everyone to the right of them says, yeah, you got to have your pastors, priests trained in seminary and vetted. And Quakers say, no, actually, we're going to sit together in silence, and whoever is moved by the Spirit to speak in worship, that person can get up and speak. They have just as much right as anyone else. And to enforce one person as being an authority over others is coercive force, which Jesus called us not to do. Quakers are also famously pacifists. They refuse to serve in in combat roles in the military. When they get drafted, they say, I'll serve as a chaplain or I'll serve in the hospital, but I won't carry a weapon and shoot at my fellow human being. Just to the left of them, and at different times, so just to the left of them, I put Jehovah's Witnesses, right? They're out there witnessing in that street corner. I put the Jehovah's Witnesses just to the left of them, and once again, this is not a political thing. Quakers and Jehovah's Witnesses have a lot of overlap, but at this point in history, I think Quakers are more involved in government than Jehovah's Witnesses are. For those who don't know, Richard Nixon was a Quaker. You're like, that guy was a pacifist? Well, he called himself a fighting Quaker. Jehovah's Witnesses today, they not only refuse to serve in combat roles in the military if they get drafted, they also refuse to pledge allegiance to the flag because their allegiance belongs to God alone. And they also refuse to vote. And actually, historically, Quakers have often refused to vote as well. I think that is less true these days. And the reason why Jehovah's Witnesses refuse to vote is, well, if I think I should not use force on someone else, if I vote, what I have said is the government should use force to enact whatever I just voted for. And so they say voting is just delegating the use of force to someone else. Something to think about, yeah? To say, right, if I disagree with the government's war, but I'm still participating in elections, I am implicitly saying, well, I am agreeing to be a part of this process, even if the vote doesn't go my way. I still say this is a valid system. And if the government's going to use force in a way I disagree with, I have to bear responsibility for that. And so the Jehovah's Witness and historically Quaker response has been, I just won't vote at all. And I put Jehovah's Witnesses further separate from the government than Quakers today because I feel like Quakers today, even if Quakers choose not to vote, Quakers seem, and historically have always been, very involved politically. Even if a Quaker chooses not to vote, they are sure going to try to influence people with power in the direction they think is appropriate. And from what I can tell, Jehovah's Witnesses really just don't. They just, government will do its thing, we do our thing, doesn't matter. That's kind of where they're at with that. Even further down the spectrum from Jehovah's Witnesses, I've got an Amish buggy, and they are standing in for the whole Anabaptist tradition. Anabaptists came out of Germany and Switzerland in the lifetime of Luther, and they essentially took Luther's writings that we are all equal before God, and they said, well, that's true not just spiritually, it should also be true politically. And there should be no government at all. This horrified Luther. He's like, that's not what I meant, guys. So you get Mennonites, Amish, Hutterites. These are all part of the Anabaptist tradition. They have, once again, a sort of a spectrum in that tradition. It's worth noting, the Anabaptists didn't start off as pacifists completely separate from the government. In fact, there was an early moment in Anabaptist history where they took over a city, the city of Munster, and created a violent regime that instituted polygamy and all sorts of other things. And eventually, Lutherans were willing to team up with Catholics to lay siege to the city to free it from the Anabaptists, and everyone ended up getting slaughtered in there. From that moment on, one of the Anabaptist leaders committed the Anabaptist movement to complete pacifism. Actually, they would not use the term pacifism. They would commit themselves to non-resistance, following Matthew 5 that says, "Do not resist an evildoer." So Mennonites come out of that tradition, and essentially what they tried to do is to say, can we just create a society completely separate from secular governments? Like, we don't want to be, we don't need what they got. We'll just do our own thing in our own little communities. Mennonites eventually, I guess, got too cozy with secular society, and so there was a guy who called for an even greater separation from society, who started the Amish movement. And today the Amish, right, not only do they not vote, they refuse to participate in any military duty whatsoever, right? Quakers and Jehovah's Witnesses say, we'll serve in the military, but we won't carry a weapon. And the Amish say, no, we won't serve in the military in any capacity. And so over the years, essentially what they've done is, when they get drafted, they find ways, they are farmers and provide food for the military, or they'll serve in hospitals, but not in city hospitals where there's too much temptation, right? They try to find ways where they can serve, as they are forced to do, because they're not going to resist that, but without compromising their values. It's worth noting they pay taxes, because they render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and also they're not supposed to resist. So when the IRS says, give us money or you go in jail, they say, here's money. In the most extreme version, so they also, they don't make use of the legal system. They won't use courts, right? Jesus says, if someone sues you, just give them your coat. Don't use a legal defense. This was really put to the test 20 years ago. There was a terrible mass shooting. A man went into an Amish schoolhouse and ultimately shot 10 children, killing 6 of them. The teacher ran out and did call 911, had someone call 911. So they were willing in that moment to ask the police to come and intervene. The shooter ultimately ended his own life before he was arrested. And just, if you want to just cry, look up this story. There's the commitment to non-resistance is incredible. There were 2 girls in there. When it became clear this man was going to start shooting the children, 2 of these girls said, please shoot us first, right? Because they wanted to give the other children as much time as possible to be rescued. When the shooter finally ended his own life and his name came out, the Amish community reached out to he had a wife and children. The Amish community reached out to his wife and children and said, how can we support you? We can't imagine the grief you are going through. They set up a charity. Amish themselves, they don't receive charity. They don't even have health insurance. They completely say, we have to take care of ourselves. We want nothing to do with the rest of the world. But they set up a charity for the family of the man who shot them. There's a story of, one of the fathers of the children who was killed comforting the father of the man who killed his child for an hour, holding him to his chest, right? That is the level of non-resistance to evil that the Amish have committed themselves to. There's even another group called the Hutterites, who, from the same tradition, but they say, we need to go even farther, and Hutterites don't even have private property. Their commune owns all their property together, and no individual person owns anything in it. They just all have to share, and that's the community that they feel Christ calls them to be, which is very much what's described in the book of Acts of the early church. There is, in fact, a group of people even further down the spectrum trying to withdraw from government. That's a picture of Leo Tolstoy, the Russian count and author. He wrote War and Peace, Anna Karenina. He wrote a series of books in his life on non-resistance to evil, right? He comes out of the Orthodox tradition far over on the other side of the spectrum. And he saw in Orthodoxy and in Catholicism and in Lutheranism in his day, the way church was propping up military governments. He was predicting World War I very accurately, and he's like, we're all just going to kill each other for no reason, and churches are enabling it. And he read the Sermon on the Mount, and he said, yeah, we are completely called to non-resistance. And, he corresponded a lot with Quakers. He also felt like, what non-resistance and non-violence means not eating meat. He is deeply influential in starting the modern vegetarian movement. There were several communes founded on his principles in the beginning of the 20th century, some in South Africa and in the United States. The one in South Africa, Mahatma Gandhi actually visited and spent time in, and Gandhi attributes Tolstoy as his spiritual inspiration, and of course that will go on and inspire Martin Luther King Jr. Now, none of those communes inspired by Tolstoy are around anymore, because here's the thing. The Amish, the Hutterites, it seems like, oh, hippie communes. No, right? These are highly patriarchal family structures. And there's a very rigid way of life in there, one that doesn't use violence, at least physical violence, but they make use of what's called the ban. They excommunicate people, and if you're excommunicated, it's not just that you can't have communion when they gather for church. The Amish go so far as to say you shouldn't even have meals with your family members if you get excommunicated. And so there's extreme social pressure for conformity in those traditions, which have allowed them to stay largely unchanged for 400 years. Tolstoy didn't want that, and so his communes fall apart after a few years. But his legacy, like I said, lives on very much so in the nonviolent resistance movement in Gandhi and MLK, and even today. What a spectrum of what it means to be a follower of Jesus, who calls us not to resist evil and to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and to God's what is God's. I want to do a little recap for you because I went through a lot of things. So the rejection of force could mean a lot of things. It could mean, and I left this off the very top, essentially what Luther says is, unless I have a specific government role to use force, I as a Christian will not. And then below that, you start getting things like, we reject that the state has the power to decide the religion. We refuse combat service. We refuse to pledge allegiance to a secular power instead of God. We refuse to vote, to even participate in this system that is built on coercive power. Refuse any form of military service, even if it's a non-combatant role. Will not make use of courts, not make use of private properties, even so far as to not kill animals. And there are some who even say, if you're a vegetarian and you harvest the wheat or the rice, you kill the rice plant, so you should really be a fruitarian and only eat fruit which can be given and eaten without killing the life that created it, yeah? So there is a huge, if you really take this far, there are some profound consequences to it. So I'm not here to tell you which one is right. I'm here to, I do want to tell you real quick. Sometimes it seems like, the non-resistance to violence, it's never going to accomplish anything. But I want to go back to the Crusades real quick. So I said the Crusades were started to create safe passage for pilgrims to the Holy Land. Basically didn't work. For 200 years, they tried it. Sometimes they would take over the Holy Land. Sometimes the Muslims would reclaim it. At about the year 1300, St. Francis of Assisi, patron saint of animals, he was so grieved by the shed of blood from the Crusades that he and one of his brothers, his monastic brothers, made a pilgrimage to the Holy Land and tried to meet with the Sultan personally to try to end the conflict. They, of course, got captured, and when he explained what he was doing, they all thought he was crazy, but they eventually did take him to the Sultan, and he spent, many days with the Sultan, explaining Christianity as best he could, trying to convince the Sultan to become a Christian. Ultimately, the Sultan didn't go for it, but the Sultan was so impressed by St. Francis, by the way he carried himself and his dedication to nonviolence, that the Sultan started treating captured soldiers much better, and then eventually, by the end of the century, the Sultan of Egypt would give custody of Christian holy places to the Franciscan order, and they still have custody of those places in the Holy Land today, essentially ensuring safe passage for pilgrims to those places. So what the Crusaders could not accomplish through violence, St. Francis accomplished through love. Okay. That said, maybe it helped that, there had been all those crusades and the Muslims wanted to stop fighting too. MLK used to show up to places, brief digression. MLK would show up to places and they'd, we don't want you here, Dr. King. And he'd say, well, I'll tell you what. Either I can be here and stage a nonviolent protest, or we can leave and Malcolm X can show up. And you can see how that goes for you. And they say, we'll stick with you, Dr. King. Yeah. So sometimes it is helpful to have someone who disagrees with you on means sort of a threat. All right, here's my question for you. And I actually want to encourage you to turn to each other in just a moment and chat for a little bit, and then I'd love to hear what people say. So, in obedience to Christ and his command not to resist evil, I will either use force as a function of the state, and my church should do the same. Right? This is Roman Catholic, maybe Orthodox perspective, which is church and state got to work together to squash evildoers. Maybe say, no, that's not the one for me. Maybe your option number 2. I will use force as a function of the state, but the church should not. This is maybe more a Lutheran or a Baptist perspective, which is, yes, the state needs to use force to stop evildoers, but unless I am part of that government role, I should not do it, and also my church should definitely not be involved in that. Or maybe you are a number 3. In obedience to Christ, I will live in a society that uses force, but I will not. Right? This is the Quaker and the Jehovah's Witness, which is, look, we got to live in this world. There are people who are going to use force, but I will have no part of it myself. Not even to vote. Or maybe in obedience to Christ, I will attempt to live outside of a society that uses force. I will go and form my own little farm in the wilderness, and if bandits come and kill me, so be it. I will have been faithful to Christ. All right, so for the next 5 minutes, I encourage you to turn to each other and discuss 1, 2, 3, or 4, which is the one that makes sense to you, and then I will ask people to raise their hands and say if they are 1, 2, 3, or 4. Does that make sense? All right. Those of you online, if you want to type it into the comments, love to hear. Not yet. I want to hear what people's answers are.
The what?
I want to hear what people's answers are to this. So about 2 more minutes.
Yeah. Gotcha.
And actually, AV desk, this might be the one moment. I don't know if you can, if you know how to switch to a blank slide and maybe bring the cameras over to the congregation so we have a public record of how people stand on this. All right. Hopefully you've had enough time now to sort of ponder where it is, and hopefully you chatted with someone who has a different perspective. I always think that's really fun to hear, like, okay, why? But let's start with number one. If you believe that it is appropriate to use force as a function of the state and that your church should do the same, if you are a crusader, let's have you raise your hand. Barbara, whoa, that's my stepmom. All right, okay. We're going to have some interesting conversation at dinner. All right. So if you feel that it is appropriate as a Christian to use force as a function of the state, but that the church should not be involved in that, let's see you raise your hands. How many Lutherans we got in here? All right. A shocking number of Lutherans. How did that happen? Okay. All right. If you think that as a follower of Jesus, you can live in a society that uses force, but that you personally should not, let's see a show of hands. Hey, we got some Quakers in our midst. Lovely. Yeah. Okay. If you feel like as a follower of Jesus, you should attempt to live outside of a society that uses force completely and just trust in God for your safety, let's see a show of hands. How many? Sometimes, yeah, go hang out with those Mennonites. They got good bakeries. Yeah, that's for sure. No, they do. They're delicious. Yes.
We live in a moment that none of those fit for me.
Oh, okay. Let's hear. Yeah. What would be better for you?
Well, I need to represent,
Yeah.
at the very least, to those who are suffering persecution and death
Yeah.
by this government.
Yeah.
So I do not support the government. I support the people that are suffering.
Yeah.
The horrors that are happening in the streets of Minneapolis and etc. So none of those fit for me.
So if I understand correctly, your concern is that you don't currently feel there is a government to use force in an appropriate way at this moment. Yeah. So keep with us, because we are going to be talking. So next week, what we're going to talk about is why Romans 13 in particular, but other parts of the New Testament, instruct submission to those in authority. And we'll talk about why it says that. And then we're going to talk about what throughout history Christians have expected of those in authority, how Christians have held those in authority to account, and what Christians have done when those in authority haven't behaved the way that Christians have thought they should. So we will get to those. Stick with us. Yeah. Patience. Yes. Yeah, over here.
Yeah, also, in number 3, so that's basically saying that the Lutheran Church is saying that if there's a draft, then all young people who are called to the draft should go and enlist, or if called, should go and use force on behalf of the government.
So I'm going to repeat that question. The question was, and I think it was actually number 2, right? The Lutheran position. Yeah, that's all right. The Lutheran position, the question was, does that mean from a Lutheran stance, if the government calls a draft, that the Lutheran Church says, if you are eligible to be drafted, you should be drafted? So the short answer is yes. Yeah, the short answer is yes. I know many Lutherans who did not. Yeah. It's important to say within every tradition, people live it out very differently. But if you read our doctrinal statements, that is the correct one. We will get once again later in this class to how Christians, including Lutherans, have responded when they have felt their government is asking them to do something that contradicts the teachings of God. Because, of course, Luther himself, despite saying we should uphold the government, you may have remembered, famously defied those in authority and created the biggest schism in Christian history. So there are obviously exceptions to every rule, and we will get there.
I mean, in addition to there being exceptions, if it's foundational, that
Yeah.
that's how the religion began,
Yeah.
then how would it follow that it would be like that?
That's why we have to have 5 classes. Because, no, seriously, right? These things, they often seem contradictory. And as Christians, there's not a simple answer. I so wish there was. Originally, I was like, I'm just going to create a Facebook post about this. And I was like, oh, no, this is huge. And then I thought, I'll write a sermon about this. And I thought, no, it can't even fit in this. Like, we got to wrestle with this. So keep coming back. I saw Kim over here.
I don't think we've adequately defined the word force.
Yeah, and I think maybe you came in a little bit late. But so when I say force, what I mean is coercive physical force. Force that is backed up by use of arms. Yeah? That's what I mean. Relational authority, right? I talked about in my sermon that we can try to control our family through a lot of ways, right? Through trying to write people out of a will or by restricting access to other family members or family events, right? Those are arguably use of force as well. But when I'm talking about those in authority, I'm specifically talking about coercive force backed up by arms. Yeah, because we'll see when we get to Christians who believe the government is acting contrary to God, they will find ways to resist nonviolently. Amen. Yeah. So I think you missed the slide where I said when I'm talking about authority, I don't mean Jesus on the Mount preaching on the Sermon on the Mount. That's not what I'm talking about in this class. What I'm talking about is Lady Justice with scales in one hand and a sword in the other. Yeah. But it's worth repeating, right? Because there are many types of forces, and there's many types of authority, and there are many types of coercion. And we will see Christians are very interested in using persuasive coercion and are very interested in being a force in this world. We have to claim that, and in later classes we'll talk about what are those positive forces that followers of Jesus are very much called to use. Yeah. All right. Next week, why should Christians submit to those in authority? Come and find out. See you then. Oh, sounds good. Thank you.